The autumn wind carried the scent of pine and distant snow across the Montana wilderness as 12-year-old Sarah Mitchell raised the rifle to her shoulder. Her grandfather, Colonel Richard Mitchell, stood beside her with the quiet presence of a man who'd seen 3 wars and countless graveyards. His weathered hands, scarred from decades of handling weapons, gently guided hers into position. The rifle was old, a Winchester .270 that had belonged to his father before him, passed down through generations like a family heirloom forged in steel and gunpowder. "Feel the difference," he whispered, adjusting her grip with the gentleness of a man who understood that guns weren't toys or symbols of power. They were teachers. They were lessons in discipline, respect, and consequence. "The gun doesn't kill, Sarah. The mind does. The mind decides. The gun is just the messenger." She'd heard him say this 100 times, but it never lost its weight. Sarah took a deep breath, released it slowly, and pulled the trigger. The recoil kicked hard against her small frame, but she'd learned to lean into it rather than resist. 300 yards downrange, a soda can perched on a wooden post exploded into fragments. She'd hit it dead center. Her grandfather smiled, a rare expression that transformed his stern face into something almost gentle. "That's my girl," he said. "You've got the gift." Growing up on the edge of civilization, at the intersection of wilderness and society, had fundamentally shaped who Sarah Mitchell would become. While other girls her age dreamed of shopping malls and first dates, the intoxicating freedom of adolescent romance, Sarah dreamed of something darker and more dangerous. She watched documentaries about military special operations until midnight, freezing on her bedroom floor as snow piled against the windows. She studied tactics, memorized weapon specifications, and analyzed gun ranges and ballistics with the intensity of a scholar pursuing a doctorate. Her parents didn't understand. Her mother, Alina, was a schoolteacher who'd wanted a daughter who'd play with dolls and worry about cheerleading. Instead, she'd birthed a strange, solitary child who seemed more comfortable in the woods than in social gatherings. Sarah's father, Michael, was a banker who valued stability and tradition. He'd expected his daughter to marry someone appropriate, maybe become a nurse or a lawyer, live a comfortable life in a nice house with a white fence. The idea that his daughter wanted to become a Navy SEAL was, to him, incomprehensible. But her grandfather understood. Colonel Richard Mitchell had spent 32 years in the military, had climbed through the ranks, had served in Vietnam, where he'd learned that survival belonged to those with the most discipline and the steadiest hands. He saw in his granddaughter something he recognized from his own youth, the call of something larger than yourself, the hunger to test yourself against impossible odds, the burning need to prove that you belonged among the elite. By age 17, Sarah had won every marksmanship competition in Montana. State championships, regional tournaments, shooting matches that drew competitors from across the Pacific Northwest. She didn't just win, she dominated, setting records that would stand for years. Her scores were so consistently perfect that some competitors refused to compete when she entered. Shooting against Sarah Mitchell, they said, wasn't a competition. It was a foregone conclusion. Her high school guidance counselor had suggested full-ride scholarships to colleges across the country. "You could study engineering," the counselor said hopefully. "Your math scores are exceptional. You could work for Boeing or Microsoft. A brilliant future." Sarah had listened politely, then ignored the advice completely. Instead, on her 18th birthday, Sarah made a choice that shocked her small town and bewildered her parents. She walked into a Navy recruitment office in Billings, Montana, with her chin high and her eyes burning with purpose. The recruiter, a career Navy man named Chief Petty Officer Tom Harrison, looked at this thin girl with pale blue eyes and prepared to redirect her toward support roles: administration, communications, logistics. He'd heard this speech hundreds of times. Then Sarah spoke, "Make me a SEAL." The recruiter laughed, a genuine, sustained laugh that suggested the girl had just told him the funniest joke he'd heard all year. When he finally composed himself, he explained the obvious: women didn't become SEALs. The training was designed specifically to break men. It was physically impossible, mentally unthinkable, and officially prohibited by military regulation. The SEAL program had no female operators. Period. Sarah smiled coldly, an expression that somehow made her look 10 years older. Then I'll be the first. The recruiter's laughter died. There was something in her voice, not anger or defiance, but absolute certainty. She wasn't asking to be trained. She was announcing her destiny. That night, Sarah signed the papers in the recruitment office while her mother wept quietly in the waiting room and her father stared at nothing, processing a future he'd never imagined. But her grandfather simply nodded, as if he'd known all along that this moment would arrive. He drove her to the airport himself, both of them silent during the 3-hour journey. At the gate, just before she disappeared into the terminal, Colonel Richard Mitchell did something he rarely did. He hugged his granddaughter fiercely, this tall soldier crushing her against his chest. "You're the strongest thing I ever made," he whispered into her hair. "Stronger than anything they taught me in the military. Stronger than anything I've ever seen. But they'll try to break you. Everyone will. Don't let them." He released her and looked into her eyes. "Promise me." "I promise," Sarah said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Sarah Mitchell walked through that airport terminal toward a future that no woman had ever walked before, carrying her grandfather's promise like armor, her rifle training like a birthright, and her hunger for something impossible like a flame that would never die. She was 18 years old, and she was about to change the world. The San Diego Naval Training Center materialized before Sarah Mitchell like a fortress constructed specifically to destroy the weak. Her bus pulled through the gates on a cold January morning, and she watched through the window as recruits in pristine uniforms marched across parade grounds with mechanical precision. Everything about the facility screamed discipline, hierarchy, and the absolute certainty that most of the people arriving would fail. Sarah's first week of basic training was deceptively easy. It was designed that way. The Navy wanted to lull recruits into a false sense of accomplishment before introducing them to genuine suffering. She completed runs that left other recruits gasping. She conquered obstacle courses that had toppled tougher-looking men. She excelled at the classroom work, absorbing naval history and military protocol with the same intensity she'd once used to master ballistics. But the other recruits noticed she was different. The men, especially, watched her with a mixture of admiration and resentment. A few were curious about her story. Most were waiting for her to fail so they could confirm what everyone believed, that women had no place in elite military units. The instructors, though, treated her with something worse than hostility. They treated her with indifference. "Listen up, Mitchell," Petty Officer First Class Robert "Tank" Morrison had told her during the first week. "You're here because the Navy's got quotas and lawyers. That doesn't mean we're going to go easy on you. That doesn't mean we care whether you succeed or fail. You want to be a SEAL." He'd paused, his scarred face hovering inches from hers. "Then prove it, and maybe, we'll consider not breaking you." The real testing began with SEAL Qualification Training, or SQT. This was where the Navy transformed ordinary soldiers into something else entirely. The physical demands were designed to be impossible. The psychological pressure was designed to crush the human spirit, and the instructors seemed to take particular pleasure in making Sarah's experience significantly harder. During the first month, Sarah ran with a 50-pound weight vest in 100-degree heat until her vision blurred. She swam underwater until her lungs felt like burning coals. She was required to complete evolutions that seemed designed specifically to exploit female physiology, underwater knot tying that required exceptional breath control, obstacle courses that demanded specific upper body strength ratios. Her instructors watched with cold eyes, taking notes, waiting for the moment she'd break. The worst came during combat swimming phase. Sarah had always been a strong swimmer, but military combat swimming was something else entirely. Instructors would grab recruits underwater and force them deeper, simulating enemy capture scenarios. The goal was to teach soldiers to control panic and survive torture. The unspoken subtext in Sarah's case was to find an excuse to drown her. One afternoon, an instructor named Chief Warrant Officer David Reaper Santiago grabbed her during a routine evolution and drove her toward the bottom of the pool with deliberate intent. The pressure crushed her ears. Her lungs screamed for oxygen. She could see his face above her, watching with something approaching satisfaction. This was it, she thought. This was where they decided she didn't belong. Sarah stopped fighting. She relaxed completely, letting her body go limp in his grip. The paradoxical technique, counterintuitive, desperate, allowed her to slide through his hands like water itself. She shot toward the surface, broke through the water gasping, and climbed out of the pool without looking back at Santiago's shocked expression. When he called her over later, expecting to have grounds to eject her from the program, he found something that shifted his perspective. "That was dangerous," he said flatly. "So is drowning," Sarah replied. "Sir." Santiago studied her for a long moment, then something like respect flickered in his eyes. "You've got survival instinct. That's worth something." But the real breaking point came during Hell Week, 7 days of continuous, relentless training designed to push recruits beyond the limits of human endurance. Sarah hadn't slept in 72 hours. She'd been dropped in ice-cold water so many times she'd forgotten what warmth felt like. Her body was covered in salt-water abrasions and hypothermia-induced shaking. Most recruits had quit by this point. Some had been medically evacuated. Sarah remained. On day 5, during the surf torture evolution, something inside Sarah's leg gave way. She felt it distinctly, the sudden, sickening sensation of bone or ligament rupturing. The pain was instantaneous and absolute. She collapsed in the cold water and medics dragged her onto the beach. The corpsman examined her leg with clinical efficiency. "Broken femur," he said, not unkindly. "Mitchell, you're done, you're going home, that's a serious injury, no shame in it." Sarah looked up at him from where she lay in the sand, her body trembling from cold and shock. "What evolution are we doing next?" she asked quietly. "You're not doing any evolution. You're injured, you need medical." "What evolution?" Sarah interrupted, her voice thin but steady. "Are we doing next?" The corpsman exchanged a look with the instructor overseeing the evolution. Something unspoken passed between them. The instructor, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reed, walked over and knelt beside Sarah. He was an older man, Vietnam era, with eyes that had seen things most people couldn't imagine. "You can't continue with a broken femur, Mitchell. It's not about toughness, it's about physics. Your leg won't support you." "Then I'll crawl," Sarah said, and she meant it absolutely. Reed studied her face for what felt like an eternity. Then he stood and said something that would change everything. "Tape her up. She continues." The final 3 days of Hell Week, Sarah Mitchell moved through the training on a shattered leg. Her pain transcended into something abstract and distant. She stopped being a girl trying to prove herself. She became something else, something elemental and unstoppable. She moved through fire and ice, through exhaustion and agony, no longer fighting the training but becoming one with it. When Hell Week ended, Sarah collapsed on the beach and didn't move for an hour. But she'd completed it. She'd survived what the Navy had designed to destroy her, and something profound had shifted in the eyes of everyone who'd watched her refuse to quit. Chief Reed stood over her as medics prepared to take her to the hospital. "You're insane, Mitchell," he said. Then he added quietly, "and you're going to be a legend." The C-130 transport plane descended through thick clouds toward Al-Assad Air Base in western Iraq, and Sarah Mitchell felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't training. The weapons beside her were loaded with real ammunition. The soldiers around her were heading into actual combat where insurgent bullets killed on impact, where IEDs shredded bodies into unrecognizable fragments, where death waited in 100 different forms. She'd earned her SEAL Trident 6 months ago in a ceremony that had been bittersweet. The other operators had congratulated her with genuine respect, but she'd also seen the doubt in many eyes. SEAL qualification proved you could survive the training. It proved nothing about combat performance. Real proof came only in the field under fire when bullets started flying and people started dying. Her first deployment was to SEAL Team 6, attached to a joint task force hunting high-value terrorist targets throughout Iraq and Afghanistan. The team she joined had been operating together for 3 years. They were a family forged in shared trauma and countless operations, and they had absolutely no idea what to do with a female operator. Sarah was assigned to work as a sniper, which was perfect for her skill set and terrible for team cohesion. Snipers operated in pairs, a shooter and a spotter, working in isolation, responsible for eliminating targets from extreme distance. The Army needed a spotter for her, and they assigned Senior Chief James "Ghost Rider" Donovan, a 20-year veteran with 73 confirmed kills and a reputation for brutal efficiency. Their first meeting was in the operations briefing room. Donovan was tall, scarred, with eyes that seemed to have seen the absolute worst humanity had to offer. He looked at Sarah with undisguised contempt. "You're the political statement," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Command sent you here to check diversity boxes and satisfy lawyers. You'll be dead in 6 months or you'll get someone else killed. Either way, I'll have to do the paperwork." He turned his back to her dismissively. "Try not to slow me down." Sarah had learned that responding to male hostility with anger only confirmed their prejudices. Instead, she simply responded, "I won't." Their first week together was torture of a different kind. Donovan pushed her mercilessly, not out of training but out of spite. He'd force 16-hour days of scouting, repositioning, equipment checks. He'd deny her proper food, suggesting she was too weak to need calories. He'd deliberately give her inaccurate wind readings during practice to see if she was paying close enough attention to catch his lies. She caught every single one. By the second week, Donovan's contempt had transformed into curiosity. Sarah didn't complain. She didn't ask for sympathy. She simply performed. Her shooting was precise. Her observation skills were exceptional. She understood wind and distance and ballistics the way some people understood music, not as technical data but as poetry. Their first confirmed kill came on a dusty afternoon in Anbar province. Intelligence reported a Taliban commander meeting with insurgent cell leaders near a remote compound. Sarah and Donovan set up on a ridgeline 1,200 meters away, obscured by rock formations and careful camouflage. They waited for 6 hours without moving, barely breathing, maintaining absolute silence. Then the target emerged, a tall man in traditional dress walking toward a courtyard where other insurgents gathered. Sarah's scope found him. She calculated distance, wind speed, elevation changes. Her finger tightened on the trigger, and for exactly 0.3 seconds, a fraction of a moment, she hesitated. She saw him as a human being, not as a threat or a target, but as a man whose mother had once held him as an infant, who had dreams and fears and a complete interior life. That hesitation, that split-second acknowledgement of his humanity, nearly cost her everything. The shot went downrange perfectly. The man fell, dead, but that moment of hesitation had been visible, at least to Donovan, who'd been watching her face through the spotting scope. They didn't speak until extraction. Back at the base, Donovan found her in the operations tent, just sitting, staring at nothing. He didn't say anything initially. He simply sat beside her, this grizzled veteran and this young operator, two people who just watched someone die through their combined effort. Finally, Donovan spoke, his voice low and steady. "Listen to me carefully, Mitchell. That hesitation you had out there, the moment where you saw him as a person instead of a target, that will kill good men. Better men than him. You understand, soldiers under our protection. People with families waiting for them. If you can't make peace with what we do, if you can't accept that every target we eliminate is someone trying to kill our brothers, then you need to get on a plane and go home." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She thought about her grandfather's lessons. She thought about the rifle instructors who taught her that the mind decided, not the gun. She thought about the Taliban commander she just killed, and all the innocent people his organization had murdered. "I'm not a killer," she said quietly. "I'm a protector. Every person I eliminate is someone who would kill my brothers. I need to remember that." Donovan studied her face for a long moment. Then he nodded once sharply. "Now you're understanding." Over the next 18 months, Sarah underwent a profound transformation. She and Donovan became a unit, a perfectly synchronized pair of killers masquerading as protectors. Her confirmed kill count climbed steadily. 15 kills, then 30, then 50. By the end of her first deployment, she had 87 confirmed targets. But the numbers meant nothing to her. What mattered was that other SEALs started requesting her specifically for operations. Soldiers began sleeping easier when Ghost was on the ridgeline above them. Enemy fighters started looking over their shoulders, knowing that a silent death could come from anywhere. Donovan, who'd once despised her, became her closest friend. They developed a language of glances and hand signals that needed no explanation. In the absolute silence of the sniper's nest, they understood each other completely. By the end of that deployment, when Donovan recommended her for a commendation, he did so with absolute conviction. "She's the best sniper I've ever worked with," he'd told command. "Gender doesn't matter, skill does, and Ghost has more skill than anyone I've ever seen." Standing on the tarmac, waiting for the transport plane that would take them home, Sarah looked out at the Iraqi desert and felt something settle inside her. She'd found her purpose. She'd found her place. And she'd earned the respect of men who earned respect through blood and sacrifice. The Angel was beginning to take flight. The radio crackled at 5:30 hours with the mundane operational chatter that Sarah had come to know too well. "All units, this is command. Proceeding to target location. Intelligence confirms light resistance. Light resistance. Movement to objective in T-15 minutes." Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hartley, commanding the Joint Task Force operation, sounded calm, professional, certain. Sarah had learned to distrust certainty. She was perched on a ridgeline 1,800 meters northeast of the valley, her ghillie suit blending seamlessly with the Afghan rock formations. Beside her, James Donovan was making final adjustments to the spotting scope, his movements precise despite the pre-dawn darkness. Their position overlooked a narrow mountain valley, a natural corridor carved by ancient water flow, now serving as the primary approach to a suspected Al-Qaeda intelligence facility. 120 service members were moving into that valley, 60 Navy SEALs from 3 different teams, 30 Army Rangers, 25 Special Forces operators, and assorted support personnel from Air Force combat controllers to Navy intelligence analysts. It was supposed to be a precision operation, in and out, eliminate the high-value targets, secure intelligence materials, and extract before enemy forces could respond. Sarah checked her ammunition one final time. 12 loaded magazines for her primary weapon, 8 magazines for her backup rifle, and a knife that had been with her since SEAL training. Beside her lay thermal imaging equipment, a laser rangefinder accurate to plus or minus 1 meter, and wind-measuring devices that could detect the slightest breeze. Everything was prepared. Everything was perfect. Except something felt wrong. Sarah had developed an instinct over 3 years of combat operations, a gut-level warning system that operated below conscious thought. Her grandfather had talked about it during their shooting sessions. Some people have a sixth sense. They feel danger before they see it. Trust that feeling. It'll keep you alive. Sarah's instinct was screaming now, a high-pitched alarm in the back of her mind. "You feeling it too?" Donovan asked quietly, as if he'd read her thoughts. "Yeah," Sarah confirmed. "Something's off about this operation." "Intelligence reports light resistance," Donovan said, but his tone indicated skepticism. "Command briefed it as a straightforward target acquisition and elimination." "Intelligence is sometimes wrong," Sarah replied. She'd seen intelligence failures before, assumptions made by analysts who weren't on the ground, who couldn't feel the weight of terrain or read the subtle signs that combat veterans understood instinctively. Below them, the first elements of the task force began moving into the valley. Sarah could see them through her scope, soldiers in combat formations, weapons ready, moving with professional efficiency toward the objective 2 kilometers deeper into the narrow passage. The terrain funneled them into a predictable pattern. If someone wanted to create an ambush, Sarah thought, this would be the perfect location. And then her radio crackled with a transmission that changed everything. "All units, this is Recon Team 2. We've got movement on the northern ridge. Multiple personnel bearing," the transmission cut off in a burst of static. No conclusion, no clarity, just sudden silence. Sarah's eyes snapped toward the northern ridgeline. For a moment, she saw nothing. Then movement, dozens of figures, hundreds of figures, emerging from concealed positions like a swarm of insects. Enemy fighters, numbering far more than intelligence had suggested, materializing from bunkers and caves that had been carefully hidden. The valley erupted. Machine gun fire from the northern ridge cut downward at a devastating angle. Soldiers screamed. 3 men went down immediately, their bodies torn apart by the initial volley. Then the eastern ridge opened up with mortar and rocket-propelled grenades. Explosions flowered across the valley floor, sending plumes of dust and debris high into the air. "Contact, heavy contact. We've got enemy on all sides." The radio was chaos now, multiple transmissions overlapping, voices rising in panic and urgency. Lieutenant Colonel Hartley was trying to organize a response, but his orders were being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of incoming fire. Sarah watched the valley transform into hell. Soldiers scrambled for whatever cover they could find, rocks, ravines, the corpses of their fallen brothers. But there was nowhere that was truly safe. The insurgents had prepared this ambush with meticulous precision. 3 sides of the valley had enemy positions. The 4th side was a cliff face. The 120 trapped soldiers were in a perfect kill zone. "Ghost, what are you seeing?" Donovan's voice was calm, but Sarah could hear the underlying current of rage. He wanted to rain death on these insurgents. He wanted to turn the tide with the most lethal tool in his arsenal, the sniper team. "Looks like at least 300 enemy combatants," Sarah reported, her voice steady despite the horror unfolding below. "Northern Ridge is the main position. Eastern Ridge has mortar and RPG teams. They've got this valley locked down tight." She paused, assessing the situation. "We can reduce their effectiveness, but we can't stop this alone." A young second lieutenant, Sarah could see his insignia through her scope, was trying to organize a defensive perimeter. He was shouting orders, rallying soldiers, attempting to establish a coordinated response to the overwhelming fire. It was brave. It was also futile. Without air support or additional ground forces, the task force was trapped. Then the lieutenant took a bullet through the throat. He fell silently, his body crumpling like a puppet with cut strings. "That's it," Donovan said, and there was something ancient and terrible in his voice. "We go to work." Sarah's breathing became mechanical. Her heartbeat slowed. The world contracted until all that existed was her scope, her trigger, and the targets beyond. Above them, the sun was just breaking the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah Mitchell was about to paint that same sky in shades of blood. "First target," she said quietly. "Enemy commander, North Ridge, gray coat, standing behind the machine gun position." "Got him," Donovan confirmed. "Wind 3 knots from the west, distance 1,240 meters, elevation adjustment." "Already compensated," Sarah said. She took a breath, released it slowly, and her finger tightened on the trigger. The shot echoed across the valley. The enemy commander fell. Sarah was already tracking her next target. Below them, 120 soldiers were trapped in a nightmare with no escape. Above them, in a sniper's nest on a barren ridgeline, 2 operators were preparing to become something between warriors and angels. The battle for the valley was about to begin. The first shot was perfect. The enemy commander crumpled, and for a fraction of a second, confusion rippled through the insurgent ranks. Then the machine gun resumed firing, and the organized response to Sarah's presence became immediately apparent. The insurgents had anticipated sniper support and were prepared to counter it. Spotter position, Eastern Ridge, 900 meters, see the guy with the binoculars. Donovan's voice was a calm metronome in her ear. He's coordinating the eastern sector. Take him. Sarah's scope found the target instantly. A Taliban spotter, eyes pressed to binoculars, directing mortar fire down into the valley. She calculated wind drift, elevation adjustment, and the slight movement of the target's breathing. The shot was 900 meters, a distance that most conventional snipers would struggle with. For Sarah, it was routine. She fired. The spotter's head snapped backward. He fell like a marionette with cut strings. "Two down," Donovan said. "Contact front, North Ridge machine gun nest, approximately 200 meters left of our last target. They're shredding the soldiers in the valley below. Take them." What followed over the next 8 hours was something beyond human capability, a masterclass in precision marksmanship that would later be studied in military academies worldwide. Sarah Mitchell became a force of nature, a singular instrument of controlled death operating with mechanical efficiency. The machine gun nest required 3 shots. The first eliminated the primary gunner. The second killed the assistant gunner. The third destroyed the ammunition supply, triggering a small explosion that scattered enemy fighters. But the moment those bodies hit the ground, Sarah was already tracking her next target. The enemy adapted quickly. Insurgent commanders, realizing that a single sniper was systematically destroying their coordinated attack, repositioned personnel and used buildings as cover. They moved soldiers beneath rock overhangs that limited Sarah's firing angles. They placed civilians in visible positions, trying to force her into moral compromises. Some insurgents even wrapped themselves in white cloth, attempting to blend with the dust clouds created by explosions. Sarah didn't flinch. Donovan fed her information with mechanical precision. Enemy commander, 1,400 meters, moving through the Wadi tan outfit carrying RPG launcher. Sarah found him. 1 shot. The commander fell, and his RPG never reached the soldiers below. By hour 3, her weapon was overheating from continuous fire. The barrel had become dangerously hot, accuracy degrading. She switched to her secondary rifle without hesitation, barely losing a beat in her deadly rhythm. Ammunition crates were draining faster than she'd anticipated. She redistributed her fire, making every round count. Instead of defensive suppressive fire, she focused on targets that posed the greatest threat: mortar teams, RPG gunners, enemy leaders attempting to coordinate attacks. The enemy made the mistake of concentrating their forces for a major assault on the trapped soldiers. Hundreds of insurgents moved into attack formations, attempting to overwhelm the defensive positions through sheer numbers. It was the kind of assault that would have succeeded if Sarah hadn't been watching. She eliminated the assault leaders first, the commanders directing the charge, then the sergeants attempting to reorganize the troops, then the machine gun teams providing covering fire. The coordinated assault collapsed into chaos as insurgent soldiers, suddenly leaderless and under withering sniper fire, began retreating or dying in place. 450 meters, North Ridge, 3 enemy fighters moving toward a new mortar position, Donovan called. "Take them." 3 shots, 3 bodies. The mortar team never reached its destination. Sweat was pouring down Sarah's face, mixing with the dust that clung to every surface. Her shoulder was screaming from the recoil of hundreds of shots. Her eyes burned from staring through the scope for hours without rest. Her breathing had become purely mechanical, calculated inhalations and exhalations timed between shots to minimize weapon movement. But she didn't stop, couldn't stop. Below her, soldiers were still dying, still trapped in the valley with insurgents attempting to finish them. Every target she eliminated was a threat removed, a life saved, a brother brought closer to home. By hour 6, the enemy's coordinated attacks had devolved into desperate, scattered attempts to maintain fire on the trapped forces. Morale was clearly breaking among the insurgents. They were being systematically eliminated by an unseen sniper who seemed to see everything, who never missed, who operated with the precision of a machine and the ferocity of something ancient and terrible. Sarah made her most impressive shot at hour 6.5. An enemy sniper, clearly trying to counter her effectiveness, had positioned himself on a distant ridge. Distance, 2,100 meters. Wind, unpredictable, shifting between gusts and dead calm. The target was partially obscured by rock formations, with only his head and shoulders visible. Donovan looked at her. That's a prayer shot, Ghost, that distance, that angle. Call the wind, Sarah interrupted quietly. He did. Sarah breathed, released, and fired. The round traveled 2,100 meters, accounting for wind shear, elevation drop, and the Earth's curvature at that extreme distance. It struck the enemy sniper dead center in the chest. He fell without firing a shot. Jesus Christ, Donovan whispered. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. By hour 7, the enemy had stopped coordinated attacks entirely. They were in survival mode now, individual fighters attempting to escape the valley rather than continue the assault. Sarah didn't allow them to escape unopposed. She maintained suppressive fire, herding fleeing insurgents toward kill zones, preventing organized retreats. When the extraction helicopters finally descended into the valley at the 8-hour mark, Sarah maintained covering fire until the last soldier was safely aboard. Only then did she allow herself to relax, to lower her weapon, to acknowledge the weight of what she'd done. 91 confirmed kills in 8 hours. Donovan was staring at her with an expression between awe and horror. That's not possible, he said. That's not humanly possible. Sarah lowered her weapon slowly, her hands trembling not from fear but from the weight of what her mind and body had just accomplished. She looked at Donovan with empty eyes and whispered, "We got them all out." "Every single one," Donovan confirmed. "Not one casualty, not one." As the last helicopter lifted off and banked hard toward safety, Sarah Mitchell sat in her sniper's nest and understood, for the first time, what it meant to be something other than human. She'd become an angel of war. The extraction helicopters banked hard over the Afghan mountains, their rotors cutting through the thin mountain air with desperate urgency. Inside the CH-47 Chinook, 120 soldiers, bruised, bleeding, traumatized but breathing, sat in stunned silence. Some were crying. Some were praying. Most were simply staring at nothing, processing the reality that they were alive, that they'd survived something that shouldn't have been survivable. In the seat beside him, a young Army captain whose name tag read Rodriguez gripped Sarah's shoulder with a grip that bordered on painful. "You saved us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You and your spotter. You saved every single one of us." Sarah didn't respond. She was staring out the window at the Afghan landscape passing below, her hands still trembling slightly, her pupils still dilated from 8 hours of adrenaline and focused intensity. Speaking required energy she didn't have. Movement required conscious effort that felt impossible. She transcended normal human functions for 8 hours. Now that the battle was over, her body was beginning to register the cost. The forward operating base at Bagram appeared below them, and the helicopters began their descent. Medics were already assembled on the tarmac, prepared to treat casualties. But as the aircraft touched down and soldiers began disembarking, a remarkable fact became immediately apparent. There were no serious casualties. No one with life-threatening injuries. No body bags. Just 120 people who'd walked through hell and emerged relatively intact. The entire base knew within 30 minutes. Rumors spread like wildfire. The Joint Task Force had been ambushed by overwhelming enemy forces. They should have been annihilated. Instead, a female sniper had held an entire valley, had eliminated enemy fighters at an inhuman rate, had saved everyone. By evening, soldiers were talking about her in reverent whispers. By morning, the story had transformed into something approaching mythology. The official body count began at dawn. Colonel Marcus Wheeler, the base commanding officer, personally oversaw the intelligence assessment. Soldiers moved through the valley with clinical efficiency, photographing enemy bodies, collecting weapons, documenting the scale of the engagement. The count started: 20 confirmed kills, then 40, then 60. By midday, the count had reached 81. Intelligence analysts were rechecking their numbers, wondering if they'd miscounted. By evening, they'd found 89 bodies and confirmed 91 kills based on blood evidence and witness testimony from soldiers in the valley. At 2100 hours, a young intelligence officer named Captain James Chen walked into the operations tent where Sarah was sitting alone, wrapped in a thermal blanket despite the desert heat. She'd been in that same position for 14 hours, barely moving, barely eating, barely speaking. Her eyes were focused on something beyond the tent's canvas walls, something internal and terrifying. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Chen said carefully, as if approaching a wild animal that might attack without warning. "I need to brief you on something. The official count from the valley. We've confirmed 91 enemy combatants eliminated. Based on the physical evidence, ballistic analysis, and witness testimony, 91 of those kills were from your position. 91 confirmed kills in 8 hours. That's—" He paused, searching for words adequate to the magnitude. "That's the highest sniper kill count in modern military history, by a significant margin." Sarah didn't respond. She didn't move. She didn't acknowledge that she'd heard him. Captain Chen waited for several minutes before quietly departing, leaving her alone with the weight of 91. Donovan found her there an hour later. He didn't say anything initially. He simply sat beside her on the cot, this grizzled veteran and this young operator, two people who just achieved something that transcended the possible. They sat in silence for what felt like forever. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice thin and distant. "Did we get everyone out?" "Every single one," Donovan confirmed slowly. "Not one friendly casualty. Not one. You saved 120 lives today, Sarah. You saved all of them." Sarah's eyes closed, and a single tear traced down her cheek. Not a tear of joy or relief, but the tears of someone who understood the absolute price of what she'd accomplished. 91 deaths. 91 human beings. 91 families who would receive notifications. 91 mothers who would grieve. 91 children who would grow up fatherless. That night the story spread through the base like wildfire. Soldiers gathered in small groups, speaking with reverence and awe about the female sniper who'd held an entire valley. A grizzled sergeant named Marcus Stone Thompson was sitting in the NCO club, nursing a beer, when someone asked him directly, "What do you think happened out there? How is that even possible?" Stone thought about the soldiers he'd served with, soldiers who'd been talking about Sarah's impossible shots, her mechanical efficiency, her seeming immunity to fatigue and fear. He thought about the 120 lives saved, about what would have happened without her intervention, and he said something that would define her for the rest of her career. "She was an angel down there," he said quietly. "An angel of war. That's the only explanation. She was something divine, something sent to save us." The phrase resonated. It captured the incomprehensible nature of her achievement in a way that cold military statistics couldn't. By the following morning, soldiers across the base were using it. By the end of the week, it had reached military command. By the end of the month, it was official military parlance. She wasn't Sarah Mitchell anymore, or Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, or even Ghost. She was the Angel of War. The nickname had taken root so deeply that attempting to suppress it would have been pointless. It was organic, spontaneous, born from the genuine awe of soldiers who'd watched something that approached divine intervention. Official command recognized the nickname's power and stopped fighting it. When the Pentagon eventually began releasing details of the operation, they didn't discourage use of the name. The Angel of War. It was perfect marketing for a female operator, proving that gender was irrelevant in special operations. It was also accurate in ways that transcended politics or public relations. She'd looked into the face of death for 8 hours and returned victorious. She'd held 120 lives in her hands through nothing but discipline, precision, and will. She'd become something beyond human. She was the Angel of War, and she would carry that name and the weight of those 91 deaths for every day of her remaining life. The nightmare started on the third night after the valley. Sarah would wake screaming, sheets soaked with sweat, her heart jackhammering in her chest as if still in combat. She'd see faces through her scope, not faceless insurgents but human beings with complete interior lives. She'd see mothers she'd never met, mourning sons they'd never see again. She'd see children growing up without fathers. 91 times over, she'd lived the ripple effects of her precision. Donovan found her one night sitting on the roof of the operations building, legs dangling over the edge, staring at the Afghan night sky. He sat beside her without speaking, understanding that some silences were more comfortable than words. After an hour, Sarah finally spoke. "Do you ever think about them?" she asked quietly. "The ones you've killed, do you ever wonder what their lives would have been if you hadn't been there?" Donovan was quiet for a long moment. "Every single day," he admitted. "I've got 73 confirmed kills, Mitchell. I've carried them all for 20 years. Some nights I can name everyone. Some nights I can barely remember their faces. Both scenarios are torture in different ways." "How do you live with that?" Sarah's voice was thin, almost childlike. "You don't live with it," Donovan said. "You live alongside it. You understand that you made moral choices in specific moments with incomplete information. You understand that every target you eliminated was a threat to your brothers, and you spend the rest of your life ensuring that your sacrifice meant something. That's how you carry it." Sarah was promoted to lieutenant commander within 6 months of the Valley operation. The Pentagon wanted her for recruitment commercials, book deals, motivational speaking tour. She refused almost everything. Instead, she volunteered to teach at the Naval Special Warfare Center, training the next generation of SEAL snipers. She became an instructor with a reputation for brutal honesty. Her courses were the most sought after in special operations training, but also the most emotionally demanding. She didn't just teach marksmanship. She taught responsibility. In quiet moments between training evolutions, she'd pull aside individual students and say something that stayed with them forever. "You think this is about being the best shot," she'd tell them. "It's not. This is about being precise enough that when you take a life, that life was absolutely a threat. This is about carrying the weight of your decisions for the rest of your life. This is about understanding that 91 people died because I was good at what I do. If you can't accept that moral reality, get out now. Don't wait until you're in the field." Most students stayed. They understood they were in the presence of someone who'd transcended the profession and reached something approaching mastery. Under Sarah's instruction, SEAL sniper teams produced the highest qualification rates and the most disciplined operators in military history. She didn't make them better shots. She made them better human beings capable of being lethal weapons. Her relationship with Donovan deepened in ways that transcended professional partnership. They'd survived something together that bonded them in ways civilian relationships never could. They understood the weight each carried, the ghosts that followed them through daily life. Donovan had been married twice before, both marriages destroyed by the emotional distance required to process combat trauma. With Sarah, he didn't have to pretend. She understood without explanation. One autumn evening, standing on a cliff overlooking the Virginia coast, Donovan did something he'd promised himself he'd never do again. He pulled out a ring and simply held it, no words, no grand gesture. Sarah looked at the ring, then at Donovan, and understood everything that gesture contained. The offer to share the weight, the willingness to hold some of her burden, the recognition that together they might be less broken than apart. "Yes," she said simply. Their wedding was small, 40 people maximum, all of them operators, all of them understanding without being told why Sarah and Donovan needed to commit to something permanent. Chief Marcus Reed, the man who'd first recognized Sarah's potential in Hell Week, walked her down the aisle with tears streaming down his weathered face. When he placed her hand in Donovan's, he whispered something only they could hear. "Take care of each other. That's the real mission." 3 years later, Sarah gave birth to a daughter named Emma. The entire SEAL community celebrated. The angel now had something to live for beyond duty, beyond the ghosts of 91 dead insurgents. When Sarah held her daughter for the first time, something shifted in her understanding of the valley. Those 91 deaths had created the conditions for her daughter to exist in a world that was fractionally safer, incrementally more secure. She still didn't sleep well. The nightmares came less frequently, but when they arrived, they were vivid and brutal. Donovan would hold her through them, understanding that no words could help, that only presence mattered. Sarah would wake gasping and find him beside her, a physical anchor to the real world. The Pentagon still wanted her story. Hollywood producers came calling. Netflix wanted a limited series. Sarah refused it all, choosing instead a quiet life in California with her family. She balanced intensive Navy duties with motherhood, mentoring young female operators who were breaking barriers Sarah had blazed. In quiet moments with her daughter, she'd hold Emma and whisper truths that no official narrative would ever capture. "I did terrible things," she'd tell her daughter. "I took lives. I ended futures. But I did it so you could sleep safely. I did it so 120 people got to go home to their families. That's the only thing that makes 91 acceptable." By her early 40s, Sarah Mitchell had become a legend in ways that transcended her kill count. She was known as the operator who transcended the profession and become something approaching wise. Younger snipers would seek her out for advice, and she'd give it freely, not about tactics or technique, but about living with consequences, about carrying ghosts, about understanding that being deadly came with a price that never fully disappeared. She'd learned to coexist with her trauma rather than suppress it. The weight never became lighter, but her shoulders grew stronger. 91 remained 91, but she'd built a life where those 91 deaths had meaning beyond the battlefield. She was no angel, but she'd learned to live as one, carrying grace and darkness in equal measure. The classroom at Naval Special Warfare Development Group was quiet, the kind of silence that comes from absolute focus and respect. 23 SEAL recruits sat in rigid attention as Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell stood before them, her graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, her pale blue eyes carrying the weight of 3 decades in special operations. She was 43 years old, still devastatingly fit, still capable of outshooting operators half her age. But these recruits didn't know who she was. Command had implemented a policy 5 years ago that Sarah's identity remained classified during instruction. The recruits only knew her as Ghost, a legendary instructor whose courses had produced 89% of the Navy's most elite snipers. They didn't know that the quiet woman before them had eliminated 91 enemy combatants in 8 hours. They didn't know she was the angel of war. It was better that way. Sarah preferred to be judged on her teaching merit rather than her myth. "The first lesson," she said, her voice carrying easily through the room despite its quiet intensity, "is understanding that you are not killers. You are not warriors seeking glory. You are precision instruments designed to protect those who cannot protect themselves. That distinction will determine whether you become operators or murderers." The recruits listened with the intensity of people understanding they were in the presence of something exceptional. One of them, a young woman from Oregon with the same restless hunger Sarah had carried at 18, watched with barely concealed recognition. She knew who this instructor was. Everyone in the SEAL community knew the stories, though official records remained classified. The impact of Sarah's career had become impossible to ignore. 10 years after the Valley operation, women had been officially integrated into all special operations units. Sarah hadn't done this alone, but her breakthrough had opened doors that might have remained closed for decades. Military academies now studied her methodology. War colleges analyzed her tactics. Strategic studies journals published papers dissecting her eight-hour engagement. But more importantly, Sarah had become a symbol that transcended military utility. She represented proof that excellence operated on a different plane than gender. She represented the reality that in life-and-death situations, competence was the only relevant metric. Younger female operators entering the military would cite Sarah Mitchell as their inspiration. "I want to be as good as Ghost," they'd say, understanding that aspiring to technical excellence was more powerful than aspiring to break barriers. The broader cultural shift was subtler but profound. Military skepticism about female operators had transformed into enthusiasm, not because of political pressure or diversity initiatives, but because the results were undeniable. Female snipers, female combat controllers, female operators across special operations were producing outcomes that matched or exceeded their male counterparts. Sarah had proven the principle, and others had validated it through performance. Her personal impact was equally significant. Over the past 8 years, Sarah had mentored 143 female operators entering special operations. She met with each of them individually before they began training, and she had a consistent message. "You're not here to prove women belong. You're here to be the best operator possible. Let your competence speak for itself. Let your professionalism be your argument. The rest will follow." Most of those 143 operators succeeded. Many had become legends in their own right. Several had surpassed Sarah's individual kill count, but they all carried her fundamental principle: excellence first, gender secondary. That afternoon, after the classroom instruction, the young woman from Oregon found Sarah in her office. The office was deliberately simple: no medals displayed, no photographs of the Valley operation, no memorabilia suggesting personal achievement. Just a desk, a chair, a wall of books on ballistics and philosophy, and a single framed photograph of Sarah, Donovan, and Emma at Emma's high school graduation. "I know who you are," the recruit said without preamble. "The stories about you are real, aren't they? 91 kills, the Valley operation, all of it." Sarah looked up from the training reports she'd been reviewing. "The reports in classified military databases are accurate," she acknowledged carefully, "but they're also incomplete. Numbers never capture the full reality of events." "I want to be like you," the young woman said. "I want to be a legend." Sarah set down her pen slowly. "Then you're approaching this wrong. If you're motivated by wanting to be a legend, you'll make decisions seeking glory rather than seeking survival. Glory gets people killed." She paused, studying the recruit with those penetrating pale eyes. "If you want to be good, genuinely, profoundly good at what you do, then approach it differently. Train obsessively. Study ballistics like they're poetry. Understand wind and distance and human behavior at levels that seem excessive. Perfect your craft not for glory but for responsibility. That's when legends happen, not as destinations but as byproducts of excellence." The young woman nodded, absorbing the wisdom. "The stories say you saved 120 people." "No," Sarah said quietly. "I eliminated 91 threats. The 120 people saved themselves by maintaining discipline and following orders. I was simply positioned to reduce their opposition. Don't confuse the two." Later that evening, Sarah sat on her California porch overlooking the Pacific Ocean, as she had thousands of times over the past decade. The sun was setting in shades of gold and crimson, painting the sky in colors that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. Donovan brought her a cup of tea and sat beside her without speaking, understanding that these moments were sacred. Emma, now a freshman at Stanford studying aerospace engineering, called from her dormitory. "Mom, my roommate asked if you're really the angel of war. I didn't know what to say." Sarah smiled. "Tell her I'm just someone who was precisely where she needed to be on a specific day. Tell her that luck and skill and circumstance aligned in ways that transcended probability. Tell her that I spent the rest of my life trying to make sure that moment meant something. Did it? Emma asked. Did it mean something? Sarah looked out at the ocean, at the waves rolling endlessly toward shore, eternal and indifferent. I think so, honey. 143 female operators trained by me are protecting soldiers. Hundreds of snipers learned responsibility from techniques I developed. 120 people had futures because 91 people didn't. That feels like meaning. As darkness fell over California, Sarah Mitchell reflected on the arc of her life. The girl in Montana with a rifle and a dream. The woman shattering barriers in SEAL training. The operator executing the impossible in a mountain valley. The instructor transforming trauma into wisdom. The mentor passing knowledge to the next generation. The mother raising a daughter who'd become whatever she chose to become. She wasn't an angel. She never had been. But she'd learned to live with grace and darkness in equal measure, carrying the weight of her choices with the strength that only comes from understanding their true cost and their genuine meaning. The legacy wasn't the kill count or the records or the medal. It was the 143 operators still fighting. It was the doctrine she'd established. It was the principle she'd embodied. Excellence transcends gender. Competence is the only relevant metric, and precision brings responsibility. The angel of war sat on her porch as night consumed the sky, at peace with herself in ways that seemed impossible after all those years of carrying 91 ghosts. She'd found her answer, and that answer was simple: just be good. Be so impossibly, relentlessly, profoundly good that your excellence speaks for itself. Everything else, the legend, the impact, the legacy, follows naturally.